Attrition warfare is we're going to go against the enemy. We're going to stand toe to toe, and we're going to punch each other in the face until one of us goes down. Now, when you add bombs and bullets into that scenario, it means we're going to stand across from each other from the enemy, and we're going to shoot each other and bomb each other until one of us breaks. And that's a very American way of fighting, is to start this attrition warfare. Because why? We've got massive supplies, we've got awesome industry, and we can get away with that. In maneuver warfare, the emphasis is on maneuver. Firepower is considered important only to the extent that it facilitates maneuver. The overall offensive mission is to win decisively by getting the enemy to surrender. In that definition, they're not even looking to kill the enemy. They're looking to make them surrender, because it's in some ways easier if the enemy surrenders. You don't have to kill them all. The focus is outward on the enemy, and a few mistakes, like outdistancing one's logistical support or shooting at a friendly unit, are acceptable and unavoidable. So that's kind of crazy, right? That you take these risks in maneuver warfare where you might engage friendly forces, you might get so separated that you end up in a bad situation, but it's because you're pushing the pace. Control is decentralized, and every subunit or individual is encouraged to display the initiative needed to react successfully to the local threat. And this is the biggest distinguisher between attrition warfare and the way it's run and maneuver warfare. Decentralized command. Everybody that's out on the battlefield, every individual unit leader can make decisions on their own, and they can make something happen. They can react and they can execute without having to run it up the chain of command. That's maneuver warfare. Very, very different. And these days where we see the big difference, you see a big bureaucratic company. Now that we're working with businesses, we see a big bureaucratic company. They become very centralized in their control, and they fight attrition warfare against other companies because they're bigger and they have more resources. Whereas you see the young startups, what are they doing? They're doing maneuver warfare. They've got decentralized command. They've got people taking chances. They're taking risks, and they've got different leaders out there on the battlefield that are trying to make things happen. The emphasis is on training personnel well enough ahead of time that they can follow their commander's intent in combat after only receiving broad guidance. Of course, subunit must still keep their commanders informed of any actions that might affect adjacent units. So you end up with a situation where the commander is not telling you exactly what to do. They're giving you broad guidance. Hey, this is the end state of the mission that I want to have accomplished. And they're not telling you exactly how to accomplish it. They're just telling you what they want done. So that's a difference between the two. There's a piece that's very different as well, or maybe not different, but another key element of maneuver warfare and decentralized command versus attrition warfare and centralized command. So if you're listening and you haven't been in the military before, the military is separated into two groups of people: officers and enlisted people. The officers are sort of the senior leaders who are, strategic planners, and they're the broader, higher ranking leaders. And then the enlisted are the tacticians, the folks that are shooting the machine guns, throwing their grenades, making things happen. And they do have, the enlisted servicemen also have their non-commissioned officers, which are the senior ranking enlisted guys, which are usually the expert tacticians. In the average platoon, the NCOs provide most of the collective experience. So again, you see this sometimes in the movies where they get the young officer and they're green and they don't really know what's going on. And then you get the salty old, badass that's played by a salty old, Clint Eastwood, and he's that older guy with all the experience. That's what that's saying. The NCOs provide most of the collective experience. For this reason, they should participate in most of the tactical decisions. That absolutely makes sense. This should in no way challenge the authority of the officers. Okay, that's sensible. After all, commissioned and non-commissioned officers share the same responsibilities in combat. If the lieutenant, which is the officer, is wounded, the platoon sergeant takes over. This is key, when they both work together, better decisions result. Obviously, you've got two minds instead of one. This brain trust can be further enhanced by including squad leaders. So they're saying, let's bring in more minds, more of these junior enlisted guys. Let's find out what they think. The enduring satisfaction that comes from making a situationally correct decision and then having that decision fully supported during execution far outweighs the temporary insecurity that may come from soliciting the advice of subordinates. I love that quote. I love that, because I'm going to say it again. So it's saying that the decision and the execution, doing that well, far outweighs the temporary insecurity that may come from soliciting the advice of subordinates. So, and I used to see this with these young junior officers. If they're insecure with their leadership, they don't want to take advice, and they definitely don't want to ask for advice because they feel like that makes them look weak.
Right. Or they don't know what they're talking about.
They don't know what they're talking about. Oh, they're going to lose respect.
Right.
That's all their ego talking, and it's their insecurity talking. Whereas you get a young officer that's smart and that's confident, he has no problem looking at the gunnery sergeant or looking at the platoon chief and saying, hey, chief, how do you think we should do this? Hey, chief, I've never even seen this type of operation before. Can you give me some help, or can you take lead on this? And that is the way a real leader operates. You don't always see that, unfortunately.
Same thing with the mistakes too, right? When you say, oh man, I made that mistake.
Oh, exactly.
It's hard to do that a lot of the time because you think, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
He obviously made a mistake. He even admitted it, kind of thing.
Yeah. And what the reality is, people don't actually think that. They don't think, oh, he just admitted his mistake. He really doesn't know what he's doing. No, they go, oh, okay. Well, at least he's aware of his mistake.
Right.
On the other hand, it is courting disaster to rely on one's personal impressions to provide the solution to complex scenario and then not consider whether one's subordinates have the skills to execute that solution. So don't sit there stuck in your own brain, afraid to ask anybody else, or you're going to lose. To a U.S. infantryman actively engaged in a losing effort, this shortage of reference material can be quite unsettling. And what this is talking about previously to this sentence is saying that although there's all kinds of books and manuals in the military, this detailed reference material of exactly how to do the front line. What does that point man do? What does that machine gunner do? How do they actually do it? That information can get lost because it's more past word of mouth than anything else. And it goes into talking about, believe it or not, Hackworth. With a combat commission from Korea, Lieutenant Colonel David Hackworth was no stranger to war when he was called to serve in Vietnam. After 2 tours, he pointed out that the U.S. knowledge on small unit infantry tactics had not been significantly enhanced by the longest war in U.S. history, meaning Vietnam. And here's what Hackworth said. Almost 15 years since the tragic, inevitable fall of Saigon, and he's saying this 15 years after the end of the Vietnam War. Almost 15 years since the tragic, inevitable fall of Saigon, there has been no major, honest post-mortem of the war. There have been critiques dealing with the big picture, but none has addressed the lessons learned the hard way at the fighting level where people died and the war was in fact lost. So all those lessons learned and all those, no one ever made an honest critique and dug down onto the battlefield to see what these guys could do. And I know I talked about this last time as well, is that when I first got in the SEAL teams, there was guys from Vietnam. And when those guys spoke, you absolutely listened because you were hearing knowledge. And if I didn't experience that, if I didn't meet those guys, I wouldn't have heard it. It wasn't written down anywhere. And so you've got to always remember when you do learn stuff, you got to write it down. And, Leif and I talk about that, the fact that when we got back from Ramadi, I started teaching at what's called training detachment. And he started teaching the SEALs that were coming out of, the new guys that were coming out of the SEAL training. And that's where we had the opportunity to really capture a lot of this information that we learned in Ramadi, and we were able to pass it on. And ultimately, those lessons learned are what became the book. Doctrine is not everything. In fact, and you'll hear me talk about people's biggest strengths are often their biggest weaknesses. So if you have someone that's super aggressive and they're aggressive in the business world, they're making things happen, and that's a real advantage for them, but they can get over aggressive and then they end up doing stupid things and they fail.
Right.
That's one example of how your biggest strength can be your biggest weaknesses. In the SEAL teams, we had very limited doctrine, and it was a real big weakness for us. Because if you had never run a certain type of operation before, you couldn't refer back to something and say, okay, here's the method or the written documentation of how you're supposed to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty weak. That's pretty horrible. That's a big weakness. But at the same time, it was a strength, because as the battlefield changed, as we started getting tasked with missions that we had never done before, that no one had ever done before, we were very adaptable because we were used to trying to figure things out. So it's a strength and weakness. That being said, and although we did capture much of our lessons learned, this is going back to the book here, Basic Field Manual, talking about all these manuals that capture the doctrine. Knowledge is fine, but it is useless without common sense. Common sense is of greater value than all the words in the book. And this is another thing they will stereotypically put in Hollywood movies about cops or about soldiers. You've got some guy that's buy the book. And you can see this is calling it out. This is Colonel Armour R. Sims, a guy that was in the Marine Corps on Guadalcanal. And he said that common sense was more important than anything in the field manuals, which is something I completely agree with. The central ideas of an army is known as its doctrine, which to be sound must be based on principles of war, and which to be effective must be elastic enough to admit of mutation in accordance with change in circumstance. So again, all these people that really understand war, they know that this doctrine is something that needs to be written, it needs to exist, but it needs to be adapted to. And common sense is the superior rank over doctrine. It becomes very difficult when you think about training people for situations that are unknown. It's easy to train people for something that they know is going to happen, but it's a lot more difficult to train people for something that is unknown. How do you do that? As we get into the discussion of training a little bit, the small unit, into the book here, the small unit that too faithfully follows the method in the book will eventually attempt it under the wrong conditions. Furthermore, the unit may have difficulty surprising any enemy who has read their book. That makes sense, right? The enemy is going to know your play. And by the way, all these military manuals can all be found online. They're online. They're on the internet. So the enemy definitely reads what we have. On the other hand, the unit that doesn't prepare for any particular scenario will take too long to decide what to do, automatically sacrificing surprise and momentum, and then not have the teamwork to execute what it does decide to do. So there's two ends of the spectrum. We talk about the dichotomy of leadership and how you're constantly going against opposing forces. Well, here's, you can train so hard and so specifically to doctrine that it eliminates your flexibility. The other end of the spectrum is to not train at all, and then you can't execute anything. Rommel said, the ordinary soldier has a surprisingly good nose for what is true and what is false. And that's not just soldiers. I talked about that before. That people know, even if they don't know what the truth is, they know you're not telling them it. Right. They might not know what the actual truth is. Look, in actuality, most small-scale combat is won or lost months before the battle during training. And that's something that people say all the time about mixed martial arts as well. It's during that training, as you prepare, that's what wins the battle. It's the fight camp. And it's the same thing with military maneuvers. As expected, battlefield conditions change. So too must learning. Over-reliance on book solutions in itself constitute a shortfall in training because it minimizes the importance of the unique aspects of each situation. Blind faith in standard operating procedures doesn't even constitute being well-trained. This is something that when I was running training, we caused complete mayhem on the guys that were going through training. And anybody that went through training when I was running it right now has a smile on their face because they know that they were put into scenarios that were completely confusing, distracting, disturbing, mayhem, chaos. It was just crazy. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to test their minds, not their standard operating procedures, not their shooting capabilities. We wanted to test the minds of the leaders. Could the leaders be in that chaos, step back from that chaos, either physically or mentally or both, get an assessment of everything that was happening, and then say, okay, this is what we need to do to get out of the situation or improve the situation or win the situation. The other thing that it requires, not only is that the leaders step back and have the ability to step back, but the NCOs, again, these non-commissioned officers, must love initiative and must hold what ground they have to the utmost. It often happens that a sergeant or even a corporal may decide a battle by boldness with which he seizes a bit of ground and holds it. So we tried to inspire the younger guys, the new guys, a guy that had no experience in the SEAL teams, but we wanted that guy to go, you know what? I'm going to get in this room, or I'm going to take this building, or I'm going to get to this rooftop, I'm going to get this good position. And not to do it as a rogue element, but within the confines of what the strategy was and what the plan was. Right. And that's where you end up with a unit that works together very well. One of the things that I remember of where people get locked into these, you can see it sometimes in MMA fights. You'll see a fighter that's got a good, ground game, or all he's trying to do is take the person down, using all their energy, just keeps trying to clinch, keeps shooting shots, and they're getting their shot stuffed, but they can't adapt. Mm-hmm. They don't have the skills, or they don't have the mindset to adapt. Mm-hmm. I remember one scenario where we had what's called a bunkered machine gun position. This is in a training event. So there's a long hallway. This is in an urban environment. There's a big giant building. This is all fake, by the way. But there's a big giant building. And in the end of the hallway, we've got a bad guy who's in a bunkered position. So he's in behind tables and drawers and concrete. And he's got a fully automatic paintball gun. And the SEALs are trying to go down the hallway to get him. And they're shooting at him, but this guy's in a bunkered position. They can't hit him. He's hidden. And so every time they come out the hallway to try and move towards him, he just mows them down. And first it's one guy, then it's another guy, then 3 guys, then it's 6 guys. Then it's 8 guys are laying in the hallway. Because every time they get shot with paintball, if they get shot a few times, we're putting them down. Like, okay, you're dead. Just lay down. Stay there. You're dead. Stay there. You're dead. Okay, you're dead too. They can't move. They just got to lay there.
Yeah.
So I go to the guy that's running it, and it was a platoon chief. And I walked over and I said, "Hey, chief, how's this going to work out?" And he said, I got to get these guys moving down this hallway. And I said, "Do you think there might be another way?" And he kind of looked at me, and he realized that, yeah, there's another way. He sent a couple guys back out of the building. They walked down the outside of the building to the window where the guy was bunkered in, threw a couple grenades in there, jumped in, killed the guy. But the mindset wasn't there to have the flexibility to do that. Right. And that's what we were training, because I never wanted to see guys get locked into a situation. Right. That's why all training, needs to expand your brain. It needs to expand your mind. It shouldn't constrain. It shouldn't constrain your ideas. And this is one thing that's interesting, and I think that's the evolution is you're hearing, about Conor McGregor right now, and I hate to jump on the bandwagon, but you see him doing like this movement type drills, which is really good, because what is that doing? That's training you for these weird situations, and that's another with training jiu-jitsu with Jeff Glover. He puts himself in these weird positions and does these crazy things that when it happens to him, he just has better reaction because he's used to being in these strange positions. Yeah. And when we work with corporations and work with companies, we'll do role playing with these CEOs or mid-level managers, and we'll play, Leif and I will play the unruly old, job site foreman that knows more than you do, and how are you going to deal with them? And we put them in these hostile situations and do things and say things and that throw them for a loop, that make them uncomfortable, that they don't know the solution to, and they have to think on their feet. And that's one of the pieces of training that I always like to go back to is how can we do things that surprise people in training so that we exercise their brain, not what they know. We got to get what you know.
Right.
You got to train what you know. You got to practice what you know. How do we train what you don't know? If you get the 280-pound powerhouse that shows up to the gym that's never trained before, the first time you train with him, it's going to be harder to catch him than it will 3 months later. No, maybe 3 months it'll be about the same. But like a month into it, where he kind of knows what he's supposed to try and do, but you know exactly what he's going to do, then it's easy to catch him. It's easier. So you're right. It definitely is a transitional time, and it is good to train with people that you have no idea what they're going to do. But I say this, and people kind of freak out when I say it because I'm like a structured, disciplined person. But I say it all the time. Free your mind. You got to free your mind. That's what, when I talk about this stuff, I hate when I find myself in a situation where my mind is not free to see what's going on, and I can't detach from what's known and go and enter the unknown and deal with the unknown.
Yeah.
Another thing that can affect this is our ego, and how our ego can prevent us from learning or listening to other people or other schools or other martial arts or other gyms or other perspectives.
Yeah. So
in this book, The Last 100 Yards, he talks about that. Even giving a sister organization with the same manuals credit for knowing anything can be difficult. Pride in one's unit can help to build cohesion, but it can also stand in the way of learning. Learning must always take priority over pride. How readily a military organization can assimilate new information establishes how easily its component elements can acquire new knowledge. The Germans of World War I are generally credited with developing the application parameters that define modern infantry tactics. Here's how they did it. The German army of 1914 was the most decentralized in Europe, free from all but the most general supervision and relieved by a promotion system that based strictly on seniority. Of the need to constantly please superiors, the German battalion or company commander was free to train his troops according to his own lights. So the way they advanced people was just how it wasn't based on how well you did on this particular thing. So they weren't kissing ass the whole time. It was just, you were in rank, now you get promoted. So they were free to kind of operate and do the best they could, and that had a big impact. For example, by 1918, the Germans had line infantry squads that could penetrate Allied defense lines almost at will, as opposed to, the Allies, who would always try and coordinate these big, giant, massive attacks at the same time, and you have to get everyone aligned, and you have to execute perfectly with thousands of people. That's obviously very challenging, rather than just saying, okay, our goal is to break through the lines, go and figure it out. Think of all the different creative ways that go to figure that out. And it's crazy. And that's why it was so successful. Now, the Germans lost. They obviously made some mistakes on the strategic level, and as a matter of national policy, they made some pretty big mistakes too. But that's kind of a whole nother story. Most military leaders agree that doing nothing to prepare an infantry squad for combat also does little to enhance its chances for success. Most can also agree that providing guidance that is too restrictive may cause the squad to disregard unforeseen circumstances. The answer must lie somewhere in between. That's what we've been talking about. And you see this with fighters as well. And you see fighters that prepare for a specific attack from somebody. But then that other somebody decides to mix it up and comes out and does something that's happened to me when I was cornering fighters before, where I've gone out and said, oh, I didn't expect that.
Right.
Here we go. This guy just took, John Bones just took down DC. Like, where'd that come from?
Right.
Why did he do that? So we see that kind of that mentality that throws things off, and it puts people in a predicament. So finally, to talk about decentralized command and what I would see happen with decentralized command is I tell some junior leader, okay, you need decentralized command. You need to let your guys go out and do what they need to do. And they go out on the battlefield. And this is, again, in training where no one's going to die. They'd go out and all the little leaders would get their own idea and they'd go and try and make all this stuff happen. And the commander would lose control and everyone would get crushed and shot up with paintball and the whole 9 yards. And they'd come back and they'd say, oh, I did decentralized command. It doesn't work. See?
Right.
And I would say, no, you did decentralized command, but you missed the key part of decentralized command, which is guidance, parameters, understanding of the mission, commander's intent, standard operating procedures, limits of advance, all these nice little restrictions that you put on the guys. Now, they're wide restrictions. I shouldn't have said little. They're wide restrictions. They give them a lot of mobility, but they understand what the objective is, what the end state is, what their parameters are, how far they can maneuver. Like they can know, hey, if you can't go past this building, you can't go past this road, you can't go wherever. You draw those lines so that they can operate freely within those lines. And that's how you maintain control with decentralized command.
Are you saying there are no exceptions?
No,
beyond
there can
that?
be exceptions. If I call you up and say, Echo, I'm at building 14 right now. We see enemy moving to building 27. I want to push down this road. Are we good to do that? And
Right.
you say, all right, let me check the map. Let me check where my other forces are at. Yep, you're good to go. You can move. So there are times where I have to check back with you to make sure we're good to go and make sure that you understand. But I'm going beyond what parameters were set, and that's why I have to communicate
Right.
to you. But I went all the way up to that point.
Right.
I maneuvered on the battlefield for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. Maybe it was a day. Maybe it was 2 days without having to say, Echo, I need some guidance here.
Right.
Echo, I'm going to push beyond what you told me.
You'd be responsible about making those exceptions.
And communicating.
Right.
That's when bad things happen. When bad things happen is when you go outside the limitations that you're supposed to be in and you don't tell anybody.
Oh, okay,
That's
yeah.
very,
Makes
very
sense.
problematic. Why you have to maintain that flexibility? The reason is because combat is infinitely complex. And it's one of those dichotomies because it's infinitely simple, but it's infinitely complex. And believe me, the complexity of it got the best of me on many occasions where I lost it. I could not follow the complexity of the situation. Bad things happen. I had to regroup. I had to try and figure them out. Had to assemble these thoughts in my head as all these things are happening. Go into the book. As it relates to combat, the term situation encompasses many variables: mission, enemy, terrain, weather, troops and fire support, time, space, logistics. Each category has many facets. Disregarding a seemingly inconsequential circumstance can invalidate an otherwise logical solution. One must continually study the possibilities. Continually study the possibilities. And I've seen that where one little problem can escalate into all kinds of problems. That's something that, whether it's a unit that we did just what we just talked about, which is, you get a unit that goes where they weren't supposed to be and they didn't tell anybody, that can become very problematic, as you can imagine. Because all of a sudden, you got people shooting from a building where there's not supposed to be any friendlies. Well,
Right.
guess what? You're going to shoot back at them.
Right.
So that's a horrible situation. Things with communication where, some radio frequencies go down, or for whatever reason you lose communications with people and all of a sudden you're in a black hole and you don't know what's happening. That's another situation where one little tiny piece can really throw massive complexities into the situation. Going back to Rommel and back to training, the best form of welfare for the troops is first-class training. This saves unnecessary casualties. And I think I did talk about this before, but taking care of your people, and how taking care of your people, it can mean, hey, that means we're going to cut them loose early. because that means you're taking care of them. But
Right.
the reality is the way you take care of them is to train them hard
good,
and be
yeah.
disciplined. So I will never lose sight of that one. But I wanted to throw this in there because of the fight we had in Ramadi. And it's just talking about how the fighting in the urban environment is so challenging. And it says in the book, built up areas, meaning cities, should be bypassed wherever possible. In urban terrain, the attacker may need as much as a 10-to-1 manpower advantage. And Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, the worst policy is to attack cities. And if troops are attacking cities, their strength will be exhausted. That's just for time immortal. Trying to fight in cities is absolutely the most challenging of all environments. They are 360 degrees around you.
Oh, yeah.
They are above you. They are to the left, to the right, in front of you. They're behind you, and they're beneath you. They're in the sewage systems. They're in the basements. So you're in this 360 degree fire zone. And on top of that, just about every building is a hardened fighting position.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So all you have to do is enter a building and you've got a pillbox. You've got a bunker. And so therefore it's very, very challenging. And I just talked about having a enemy machine gun in a bunkered fighting position. That's a nightmare. It's a little less of a nightmare when you have tanks to come in and blast them.
Sure.
So God bless the tankers. I love those guys. Respect for one's enemy is crucial to success on the battlefield. He is not a coward. He is not stupid. And he probably has comparable weaponry. That's from the book, How to Focus on the Enemy and Make Sure that you are respecting the enemy. Flexibility to a changing situation, again in the book. Having the ability to detect and then react to a changing situation can have great value in war. What manuals contain is mostly technique, not doctrine. This technique is merely a framework around which to build common sense solutions. And what that translates to is discipline equals freedom. You have these standard operating procedures. You work them, you refine them, you practice them, you get good at them, but you don't get stuck with them. You free your mind by having discipline. And it means that you can adapt these strict standard operating procedures. You can adapt them instantaneously and do something else with them because you're a maestro and you can make that happen. Mission type orders. And that is different from, let's say, what would be called a directive, where I say, Echo, you're going to move down this street. You're going to take this building, number 27. You're going to set security in there. And you're going to hold that position. That's different because now I've told you exactly what to do. I've said, okay, Echo, you're going to move down this street. So I'm telling you which way you're going to go. I'm going to tell you exactly which building you're going to take down. And I'm telling you to set security in there. Now, what I really want to say is that means you have to do what I just told you.
Right.
Because you have no choice. I mean, I didn't give you any other options. I told you exactly what to do. Now, what if I were to say, Echo, we think the enemy's over in this area. We want to be able to hold security on them from an elevated position. Find a building down there and make that happen. So now you've got all kinds of freedom. You might pick 27 because maybe it was the best building, but maybe 36 was, or maybe 32 was. Maybe 27 was hardened. Maybe it wasn't tall enough. But you have this organic flexibility in your mind because you've been given a goal of why you're doing the mission, not just what to do. Right. So it's very important when you're dealing with people, you know, in any walk of life, that you tell them not just what they're trying to do, what to do, but what they're trying to accomplish, what the mission is, why they are doing it. And that is incredibly important. Just like aggressiveness is important. And going back to the book, from General Howlin' Mad Smith. Since I joined the Marines, I have advocated aggressiveness in the field and constant offensive action. Hit quickly, hit hard, and keep right on hitting. Give the enemy no rest, no opportunity to consolidate his forces and hit back at you. This is the shortest road to victory. Controlling subordinates only to the extent that surprise and momentum are not sacrificed. Personnel should become so familiar with their leader's intent that they can be trusted to act on their own initiative. They should never be required to ask permission to respond to crisis situation. Seconds count in close combat. Subordinates must be trusted to act appropriately and only required to inform their leaders of decisions that might affect others. That's it. That's decentralized command. Now, you're going to think at first that this is a little bit of a stretch, but it's not. So controlling subordinates only to the extent that surprise and momentum are not sacrificed. I'm going to relate that to Jiu-Jitsu, believe it or not. In Jiu-Jitsu and in any sport, you have to train your standard operating procedures so that your body can execute them without directives, right? If you have an instinct to defend the arm lock, you will escape the arm lock. Mm-hmm. If you do not have that instinct because you haven't trained it enough, you will get caught in the arm lock. If you have to think about the move, it is too late. And that's exactly what decentralized command is. If Echo's out on the battlefield and he gets flanked and he has to ask me what to do, he's going to get killed. If Echo's on the mat with me and I slap a Kimura on him and he has to think about the defense, it's too late. He's already tapping. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I go for the Kimura and his instinct moves him out of that position, then you survive. The one more thing that when I think about that type of training, is something we used to do, was called blender drills. When you take your SEAL squad or your SEAL platoon and you just start making calls on them. Flank left, push right, strong right, center peel. You just do the most random calls. So
what do you mean calls? Like
you're making tactical calls.
Something?
You got 16 guys. They're called immediate action drills. Mm. And for instance, if you're patrolling through the desert and you start getting shot at from the front, mm-hmm. then you do what's called a contact drill. You're going to react to that contact. The contact is the enemy. You're going to do a maneuver as a group. And they're all kind of choreographed maneuvers where squad 1 goes over here, squad 2 goes over here. We lay down a base of fire. You start to move, cover and move out. But what we would do is we would mix up those calls. In the middle of one maneuver, we'd call for another maneuver. Okay. And in the middle of that one, we'd call for another one. And in the middle of that one, we'd call for another one. And what it did was it trained the mind. It trained the minds of the leaders and of the guys to expect the unexpected, as you said earlier in that cliched way, but something that's completely necessary. Trained them to be reactive and open-minded to things that were going to happen. Now, when we talk about learning, and this is the title of this chapter in the book, The Last 100 Yards, it's called Old Habits May Get in the Way. And I think it's pretty obvious what that means. Adults learn, here it is, adults learn within the context of what they already know. Ideas that are too far removed from their personal frames of reference are hard for them to accept. How often do we see that? We see it in life. We see it in the business world. We see it in combat. We see it in training. Ideas that are too far removed from people's personal frame of reference are hard for them to accept. Unfortunately, when one gets dropped into a hot landing zone on his first day in combat, it's often too late for him to learn anymore. For this reason, infantry must continually reassess and expand their frames of reference. Boom. Hello, life. For this reason, infantrymen and everybody else in the world must continually reassess and expand their frames of reference. Everybody. When one's survival is at stake, the other way can hold as much appeal as the established way. So, clearly, we see people in the business world stuck in that rut all the time. We see people in their personal lives, they get stuck in a rut all the time. So everybody has got to continually reassess and expand their frame of reference. Going back to the book. What adults know comes primarily from two sources: what they have been told and what they have experienced personally. Okay, that's pretty clear, right? I think that's pretty obvious, but this is when it gets pretty cool. They sometimes have difficulty keeping the two sets of ideas separated, becoming convinced that what they have been told is true, even though they have never personally experienced it. And that is something that you see in the military. You see in the military where guys kind of, they hear something, they make it into something that they think that they've experienced. I know it sounds crazy, but they do it. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous. And when I realized that happened, when I realized that was going on, I was very suspect of everything that got said. I was very suspect and said, well, let's make sure that we confirm these ideas before we just run out and do them.
Is that kind of like those martial arts demonstrations, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And you can imagine that before the UFC and before you actually putting two humans in a cage to brawl, it was all theoretical.
Right.
And if someone said, you know what, if you strike the person here in the neck, they will fall down.
Right.
And this is, people legitimately believe that. Hey, if you hit the person in the neck, there's a brachial nerve and it'll go down to the and they will immediately fall down. Right. And people believe that, but they never tried it, but they believed it. And there was a lot of the times those stories were mixed in with someone that had been told that they'd seen it one time or they'd experienced it or whatever. And so that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when you get into people that are not telling the whole story. And this is something I'm very careful of, is when I know something, I never claim to know anything 100%. And I will always caveat everything with, like a 99.9%.
Right.
But there's sometimes where I'm giving information and I'm saying, look, this is not 100%. I don't know this for sure, but this is what I've seen and this is what I've experienced. Sometimes I'm like, hey, listen, I know this and I have experienced it and this is what will work. And I definitely, when I was instructing in the SEAL teams, I was very clear when I was saying, hey, I have not done that type of mission before, or I have not done this in combat, or I have not seen how this would really work, but here's what I think. Because that's a lot different than this is what you need to do. Because I have seen it, I have done it, and I do know confidently that barring the common sense, this is how you should execute this. Mm-hmm. So sources, back to the book, sources have many reasons for not disclosing every facet of an issue. One is to propound more convincingly their perspective. Infantrymen can't afford to harbor points of view that aren't well-founded. They need continually to reassess their viewpoint and expand their frames of reference to encompass infantry knowledge from around the world and across centuries. Here are some choices that humans have to make. Protect the status quo or take risks necessary to win decisively. That speaks on its own. Protecting the status quo can be easier than changing it. To take action, one risks making a mistake. So that's a choice. And it's not a black and white choice. There's a lot of shades of gray in there. And how can you modulate that choice? But it is a choice that you have to be aware of. Focus inwards to prevent mistakes or on the enemy to keep pace with a changing situation. This is an interesting. Professionals of all types try to minimize errors. Unfortunately, trying too hard to do so in the military profession has some serious trade-offs. Initiative, ability to surprise one adversary, perspective on the overall picture, and learning, just to name a few. And I would say that those are the exact same in any profession. That when you are only focused on not making mistakes, how are you going to make any risks? Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, the minute that you're just like, hey, I'm going to go with what I know, and I am so guilty of this. I am the guiltiest of all in that I'm very set in my ways in the moves that I do. I do 4 submissions, maybe even 2, but they're like what I'm good at. So I do them a lot, and I go through phases, and I shouldn't even say it's phases. I go through days where I take a lot of risks and I learn more. And then I go through days where I'm just there because I have to train, and I'm going to do what I do, and I'm going to do what I do well. But that's not when I learn. That's not when I get better. Mm-hmm. I get better when I'm trying something new. And that applies to everything in life. Key to an infantryman's ability to react to whatever confronts him is his authority to exercise some initiative. You got to give your people the freedom to maneuver. You have to. In combat, the leader must personally supervise only those actions that jeopardize the overall mission and then allow subordinates to exercise initiative and make a few mistakes on everything else. Those subordinates must be able to identify mistakes as they happen without fear of punishment, or the same mistakes will happen again. This is making mistakes without fear of punishment. Dean, our buddy Dean Lister, he does these drills that he calls consequence-free drills, where he just says, okay, you're going to start, that someone's going to be on your back and you're going to try to escape, but doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what happens. If they submit you, doesn't matter. Just doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Consequence-free drills. It's just to take chances, because all of us, we all hate getting tapped out. Mm-hmm. We all hate giving up position. Right. So you do these consequence-free drills. You go, okay, I look at the guy and I'm like, okay, you're going to tap me out. It's no big deal. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to try crazy stuff. And that's what they're saying here. You got to give people the chances to make mistakes. There is, however, a point where people, you could be raised in a way where you're not responsible for your own actions because there's no consequences to what you do. So if you don't study and you get the red X's all over your tests and you don't receive any punishment for it,
right,
then you will never learn, because only he who suffers remembers. Or the correct reaction would not be you failed, you're horrible, but you failed, what did you learn? Yeah. How can we improve?
Yes.
No, there's got to be some consequence. Some people don't learn without consequence. You see that these days with some of the new generation, which you might even be a part of, but the new generation that grows up consequence free, and they don't take any responsibility for their actions. They don't take ownership of anything that goes wrong, because they've been raised in a way where failure doesn't matter and there's no consequences to their actions.
Yeah.
Trying too hard to follow the book while solving battlefield situations makes one fairly predictable, even to enemies who haven't read the book. These don't, so you have to make some changes. And back to the book, these don't have to be drastically different from what's in the book. Often it's enough just to vary the amount of speed, stealth, or deception with which the standard method is executed. Standardizing what subordinates practice in peacetime may make those subordinates easier to control, but does not help them learn the alternative techniques needed to develop momentum in battle. So that actually supports your last statement. Standardizing what subordinates practice in peacetime may make those subordinates easier to control. Mm-hmm. So if you're trying to control someone by beating them down and saying you failed, you need to do it this way and it's the only way, you're going to get more control over them, but you're going to not allow them to operate in the real world where they have to think of new ideas and think they have to free their mind.
Yeah.
From Colonel Merritt A. Edson, he goes on about how you need to fight the Japanese, and he closes with, encourage your individuals and bring them out, which is just a beautiful statement. Human beings are always trying to structure the chaos of battle, and that may be the root of the problem. Human beings want to have structure. They want things to be orderly, and combat is not orderly, nor is life, nor are relationships, nor are business deals, nor is the chain of command, nor our personalities and egos and everything that we try and do to control this chaos. The idea that we can control it is false.
Yeah.
What you have to do is you have to deal with it.
Right.
You have to let that thing squirm underneath you. You have to let it move and see where its weaknesses are and grab hold of what you can and let go of what you can't.
It's kind of like, those physio balls.
Yeah.
They're not rigid or nothing.
Well, I always talk about when I'm training with someone that's bigger than me.
Yeah.
And, you get on top. You can't hold them down.
Right.
You have to let them move underneath you.
Yes.
It can drive you crazy.
Yes.
And if you try and control the chaos of combat, you're going to get destroyed. And if you try and control everything in your life, things that are not controllable, then you're going to destroy it. If you try and control a relationship and aspects of a relationship that are not controllable, you know what you control in the relationship? You control you. You try and control the relationship by controlling the other person, when in reality, you need to control yourself. Because most people don't do that. Most people don't exercise the beauty of mind control, that they can control your mind. You can think what you want to think. You can put those thoughts into your head. You can eliminate the bad ones. You can bring forth the good ones. With mind control. Complex instructions are, at best, premature during what is usually an inaccurate assessment of the situation. So when you're looking at something and you're going, okay, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do. At best, that's premature and inaccurate, what your plan is. So when you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with that business deal and you're trying to create this very detailed plan around it, at best, it's premature and inaccurate. At best, it's premature and inaccurate. So don't get locked around. You're going to make these plans. They're going to be rigid, and here's the way we're going to do it. At best, it's premature and inaccurate. So think about what you can control and what you can't, and move forward from there. And when your relationship isn't going the way you want it to be, it's because it should be a newsflash that you can't control this other human being. You can only control you. So don't, and this goes back to what we talked about on the last show, when we talked about, you know, your family and your close friends. And, you know, we kind of got to the point where I think I was saying, hey, you can't worry about them. And you said the same thing. And I think this is a little bit more clarity on that point, is you cannot control them. So you need to grab what you can, you know, keep it as under control as you can, but you're not going to get the solid control that you might think that you desire. What if your co-host of a show comes up with examples like a trash can lid and mercury? You can't control that. All you can do is listen, nod your head, and say, good point.
Gi or no gi? Do you train both? Etc.
The answer is gi and no gi. I definitely train both. I like to train both. I don't care which one. They're both fun to me. And just as we've been talking about a lot tonight through the book, The Last 100 Yards, I want my training to be different and surprising and be uncontrollable. And when you change, it definitely affects you. When you change from gi and then all of a sudden you take off your gi and you're sliding all over the place, you have to be a better grappler to be able to deal with that. So I want to be a better grappler. So I do that. And, you know, there's something else that's in between gi and no gi, and that's when you put MMA gloves on. You put MMA gloves on, and it is somewhere in between gi and no gi, because you can get legitimate wrist control. It's hard to sneak in a choke on somebody when they're wearing gloves. So there's benefits to them all, and I try and do them all.
Do you find any benefit to doing one and or the other? You know, like if you train in the gi, there's certain benefits in training with the gi.
I think if you train with the gi, your defense has to be better because there's more friction. And so if you're going to escape an arm lock with the gi on, you have to do it very well. If you're going to escape a knee lock with the gi on, there's a lot of friction. It's a lot harder to get out. So your defense has to be better. With no gi, your offense has to be better because there are no handles to grab. It's slippery. The people can slide out of the exact opposite reasons. So I think you improve your offense more. And I will say this, my game is compatible with both, where I don't do a lot of crazy lapel weaving in between your legs, then up over your back, and then back over your right armpit and around your neck. I don't do a lot of that. I don't disagree with it. I think it's fine. But I like to, most of the moves that I do are compatible with both, or there's very small differences between the way I have the games set up.
Yeah. And Dean originally told me that same thing, where when you train in the gi, your defense starts to develop a little bit more, because you got to, like, arm lock, you're in an arm lock. You can't just spaz out of an arm lock as easy.
And even more important, actually, is not just the submission, but a cross side or
Yeah.
mount. When someone's a cross side on you with the gi on, they've got those handles, and it's very difficult
or posture
to get out.
control, wrist control, all that stuff.
And it's easier to hold them down.
Yeah.
So if you train no gi and you're trying to hold someone down with no gi, it actually takes more technique to hold somebody down with no gi than it does with gi. Even though sometimes I hear people say the gi is more technical.
Right.
I don't actually agree with that. I think they're both technical in their own aspect.
Yeah. So and holding someone down, that's more of an offensive move.
Yes.
Right. So if you're being held down with the gi, you gotta understand the concept in those techniques to get out, or whether it be being held down or submission or whatever. You have to understand those concepts. And when you understand the concepts, then you can be successful. As opposed to like a no-gi situation, you don't necessarily, I mean, you should understand the concept for sure, but you don't necessarily have to, because you could just spaz out of it. Or like an arm lock. You could, if you're sweaty, you could spaz out of an arm lock with little technique, you know, if you're strong. With the gi, it's going to be way harder to do that. So you'll kind of in a way learn more and flip-flop when you go offense to defense. It's the same kind of thing. With the no-gi, the offensive stuff, you got to understand where you got to control his shoulder. Otherwise, he's going to, have enough room to slide it out. So you have to have that perfect control to execute a good submission if the guy's good. So,
and I think, with life, what I do in life is I try and put myself in tough situations. So I'm practicing them, so I'm used to them. And, that's what the physical aspect of life is. In order to improve, you got to challenge yourself and put yourself in the worst scenarios and go and try and get through them.
Right.
Whether that's a weight room with a squat rack, or whether that's a run, or whether that's a swim, or whatever that physical challenge is, you want to make it as difficult as possible.
Or putting yourself out there.
As I have challenged myself to be outside my comfort zone into the world of humans.
Multimedia.
Yes.
They say, or I've heard, that public speaking is the number one fear of people.
I have heard that as well.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to relate to. I'm not afraid of getting up and talking in front of people. I don't understand that. I don't understand what that must feel like.
Right.
So
you understand why though?
It's really hard for me to understand.
Right. It's hard for you to relate. Right. So, okay, micromanagers. How do you deal with micromanagers?
Okay. So if you worked for me and you were super squared away, then I was a great boss and totally left you alone. If you worked for me and you were not squared away, I was a complete micromanager. So that's a little indicator. Now, I have worked for micromanagers before. Everyone does. You run into them in the world. And the best way I've figured to get out from under the draconian thumb of the micromanager is to try and gain their trust. And what you want to do is you want to be ahead of them. You want to, and actually this is something that when I was on the Tim Ferriss program, I talked about how when I told my dad I was joining the military and I was this rebellious kind of crazy kid, and he said, "Oh, you're going to hate it because you hate authority." Right. And I did it anyways. And when I got in, I was like, damn, my dad was right. I do hate authority. I don't like listening to people. And now I have to listen to them all the time. And then I realized very quickly when I was in my first SEAL platoon, I didn't want anyone to tell me what to do. And I was in charge of the radios. I was a radioman. And what I did was, if the radios had to be ready, I knew they had to be ready. I just got them ready. I got them ready ahead of time. I did everything before anyone could tell me to do it. I would come into work to be ready before anyone could tell me what to do. So I basically was completely psychotically proactive and just was ahead of the power curve on every little thing that I could be ahead of the power curve on. And eventually, it didn't take long. The people that micromanaged me all of a sudden were like, "Hey, I'm not going to bother with this guy anymore. He's already done it." Because every time they say, "Hey, do you have this?" It's already done. "Hey, did you start preparing?" They already did it this morning. Right. And eventually they say, "Oh, okay, this guy knows what he's doing." Right. And what you're trying to do is build up the trust, because that's what it is. It's a little lack of trust that people have, that things are going to go the way. And they've probably learned that somewhere, so don't hold it against them. Right. But it's your job to create a relationship with them of trust where they stop micromanaging you and move on to somebody else that needs to be micromanaged. So this is the trials and tribulations of the alpha personality. And you're always trying to go hard and go fast and make things happen. And how do you deal with this? Is someone that's asking this, and whoever you are, thank you for asking this question. Are people like me? Are they the same? And if not, how do I deal with it? Well, first of all, no, there's not too many people like me. And as a matter of fact, there's not too many people like you, Echo. And people that are listening to this, there's not too many people like you either. People are unique. And I'm not trying to make people like me or make them do the things that I do. I'm over that phase. You know, I've talked about this before. Like, there was a time where I would try and convince people about things, and I don't try and do it anymore. I'll discuss them, but I'm not here to win an argument. I'm not that concerned about you. I'm not that concerned about what you think. Again, if you're someone that I'm friends with and I'm trying to help, yeah, I'm concerned, but I'm not trying to change people's minds. But it's interesting because what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to appreciate people's perspectives. I'm trying to learn from other people. And I thought this was actually, speaking of Twitter. On Twitter the other day, I posted a little paragraph, and it's by a guy named Mark Ripito, who's a coach. He's written, probably one of the best books about weightlifting that you can get. It's called Starting Strength, Basic Barbell Training. Mark Ripito. But the opening of it is freaking awesome. And I brought it with me so I could read it to you. So here's this opening to this book about weightlifting. Physical strength is the most important thing in life. This is true whether we want it to be or not. As humanity has developed throughout history, physical strength has become less critical to our daily existence, but no less important to our lives. Our strength, more than any other thing we possess, still determines the quality and the quantity of our time here in these bodies. Whereas previously, our physical strength determined how much food we ate and how warm and dry we stayed, it now merely determines how well we function in these new surroundings we have crafted for ourselves as our culture has accumulated. But we are still animals. Our physical existence is, in the final analysis, the only one that actually matters. A weak man is not as happy as the same man would be if he were strong. This reality is offensive to some people who would like the intellectual or spiritual to take precedence. It is instructive to see what happens to these very people as their squat strength goes up. Now, that's freaking epic, right? That is an epic call out to the passion that Coach Ripito has, right? That's just awesome. So I put that on Twitter. I was fired up, and because somebody mentioned Starting Strength, and I said, yeah, of course, this is a classic. And somebody on Twitter wrote back, and it said, I disagree. I will avoid reading things like this. And I wrote back, and again, I'm not trying to argue with anybody. I just wrote back, hey, when I don't agree with people on a subject, I don't avoid it. I just try and learn from it. And the fact of the matter is, even though I think what Coach wrote is awesome, I actually don't agree with it. I don't think that strength is the most important thing in life. I think knowledge is more powerful. I think respect and loyalty and honor and treating people well, I think all those things are more important than strength. And there's been people that were incredibly weak in the world that have done amazing things and were powerful leaders and were incredible human beings. So I don't actually, believe that strength is literally the most important thing. Now, that being said, if you are smart, if you are an intellectual, then you realize that you should use that knowledge to be strong so you can not be physically bullied, so you can be healthy, so you can protect yourself, so you can be self-reliant. I mean, there's no doubt that strength is is a powerful force. But like I said, there's many other things that I think are more important. Now, but what I like about it is that hearing this opinion broadens my mind. It makes me smarter. It makes me understand how important strength is to some people, and maybe that it should be more important in my head. Because honestly, when I read that for the first time years ago, I was like, oh, you know what? That's awesome. And I should always keep somewhere in my mind that being strong is important and being strong is good. And, you know, in this day and age, people actually, I think, believe that being strong is bad. Mm-hmm. As crazy as that might sound. There's nothing wrong with being strong. You know, being strong is good. Never mind, nothing wrong. It's a good thing to be strong. I wish I was stronger. I try and get stronger. And I'm not a naturally strong person. I'm just kind of an average person that works out a lot. So my point there is number one, when you get people that are different than you, I don't try and change them. I try and keep an open mind. I try and learn from them. And I talked about this earlier tonight. People have strengths and people have weaknesses. And if people have strengths, I'm going to try and learn from their strengths. And some people have more weaknesses. And I try and learn from them as well. You get someone that's an addict. You get someone that's a sociopath. Or you get someone that's a real giver, or someone that helps. And there's people that, one thing that I don't feel like I help people enough. And so I always look at people that are very helpful and I say, okay, what can I do? What can I take away from their perspective? But, you know, if I meet someone that's an addict, I learn from them. They teach me very important lessons. People that are winners, people that are losers, I'm going to learn from both of them. Now, back to the original question of how do you deal with it? Because I'm inferring from the question that this person that asked it gets frustrated that others are not living up to their expectations. Now, this is going to sound bad when I say this initially, is that I actually have relatively, or I shouldn't say I keep relatively low expectations of humans. Meaning, when I meet someone, I don't expect to get a lot out of them. I expect to be let down. I expect people, as I talked about the other day, people are crazy. And I expect that. I expect people to do irrational things. So that's kind of my baseline. And then what's beautiful about it is I'm surprised and happy and pleasantly surprised when people are supportive, when people are reliable, when people are good people, when they make sense, when they're not crazy. And so I think setting the right level of expectations is important to keep yourself from going crazy trying to change people. And the other thing I like about this attitude is I'm not sitting there blaming on other people around me. I'm not blaming whether it's my family, whether it's my team, whether it's my people I work with. I'm not blaming them for being unmotivated or blaming them for not trying hard or blaming them for whatever. I'm just taking responsibility for what's happening for me. I'm taking responsibility. If they're not motivated, I need to try and motivate them if I care about them. If they're dragging me down, whose fault is that? That's not their fault. I'm letting them drag me down. So I'm taking responsibility of my interactions with people to make sure I move it in the right direction. And as a leader, it's my job to get the most out of people. I mean, I always talked about that. You're going to have, your whole team is not going to be studs. You're going to have people on your team that are weak. And it's your job to get what you can out of that person. Take advantage of whatever strengths they might have. Cover for their weaknesses where you can. That's what you're doing as a leader. And you're leading, whether that's leading in business or your team or your group of friends or whatever. You're taking a leadership position and you're getting what you can out of people. And that's how I deal with people that are close to me that are not the same as me. Don't want to hang around with a bunch of people. Well, I don't mind hanging around with people that are like me. SEAL Teams has a lot of people with the similar, they're like, got some similar personalities in there. which is always fun.
Attitudes, yeah.
Yeah. And I run into this with business leaders where they know they're super overachievers and they expect that level of performance out of everyone, and they're not going to get it. And the way I explain it to them, I say, listen, I understand what you want to have happen, but just because as a leader, the platoon commander is able to carry a 100-pound rucksack 10 kilometers into the target, hit the target, and walk back out another 10 kilometers, doesn't mean that everybody else in the platoon can do it, and therefore he cannot plan that mission.
Right.
And I would usually get through to them on that because they do realize that they're high performers and that they're overachievers and that they're not going to get. So how are you going to set the expectations so that you've got people that can actually achieve the expectations you've set for them? So that's right on point.
The top 3 to 10 business problems you're asked to solve.
Here's the problem. Here's the problem that we come up against in Leif and I deal with on a regular basis is we get called in due to either a lack of execution or a desire to improve execution. And this is the same thing we dealt with working with leadership in the SEAL teams. You get teams that are not executing correctly. That's the problem that we come in to solve. Now, that execution could be production, that execution could be sales, that execution could be manufacturing, it could be anything. That execution, that's what we always get asked to solve. That being said, why is there a problem in execution? And the problems, these are where you get like 5 to 7 kind of common problems that we deal with. We address most of them. In fact, we address all of the major ones in the book. There's a few nuanced ones, but generally the issues are like, you can't get people to buy in. We always hear that. Our folks aren't buying in.
Buying into what?
Buying into the plan, the philosophy, the strategy, whatever. Yeah. People don't understand what's happening. They don't understand the vision. And we go back and we say, okay, do they understand the why? How is the vision being communicated? How is the vision being translated up and down the chain of command? Because you go down from the CEO who has a vision, and the way he would speak to that vision is a lot different than the way a frontline, equipment operator is going to want to understand that vision. So is the strategy simple and understandable through the chain of command? That can cause a lack of execution. Are there silos? Are there different elements within the company that are not helping each other and supporting each other with a good cover and move? Is there micromanagement going on? We already talked about micromanagement. Micromanagement can cause legitimate problems of execution. Is there unclear guidance? That can cause problems. Is there ego interfering? That can cause problem. Is there ego driving process instead of the best methodology driving process? Sometimes it's ego driving process. So it's all these, and there's just these problems. And we've seen them all. I don't think I've seen a new problem yet in quite some time where I've said, I've never seen this before. And and they're always, these problems of execution are leadership problems, and we've seen the same thing in some way in the SEAL teams. So I think that's why we've been successful as a company going in and getting people to execute better, because we've seen it, we know how to fix it, and that's what we do.
How do you handle a boss that doesn't know as much as you, and they don't understand what you do, but they're bossy? But they bossy.
Okay, so this is actually a normal situation. This is not abnormal. Bosses often don't know as much as the frontline troops. I can tell you right now. I was the boss of 35 or 40 SEALs when I was a task unit commander, and I didn't know as much as they knew about their jobs. I didn't know what the snipers knew about sniping. I didn't know everything that the radio men knew about the radios. I didn't know, like Leif was working with the Iraqis every day. I didn't know about his Iraqi soldiers and what they were like. I couldn't pretend to know that stuff. But I was actually secure in that fact. I was okay with that. And that's what I recognized, that wasn't my job. And I was okay with it. So the question is, how do you deal with someone like that? Well, let's first recognize the fact that they are insecure in their job. So the reason I was able to let my guys run stuff is because I was secure with myself as a leader and in my position. when you're dealing with someone that's still bossy, they're trying to impose upon you how to do things. And that is because the root of that is likely, I don't want to call it out as 100%, but the root of that is likely insecurity. He is insecure about his authority, insecure about his leadership, insecure about his position. So, when you want to deal with it, how do you deal with it? Your job becomes, in this situation, to make your boss feel secure in their position. That's what your goal becomes. That means, and yes, you know what that means? It means nodding your head and giving them credit where they might not deserve it. And inflating their ego, or not inflating, but massaging their ego a little bit. And you know what that means? The hardest part of that isn't massaging their ego. The hardest part of it is checking your own ego. The hardest part of that is saying is you want to prove to them that you know more than they do. And that just bubbles up and over, and it will ruin your relationship, and it will ruin the job that you're trying to do of make them feel secure. Because you're like, hey, boss, actually, you're wrong. It's this. Well, your ego feels good, but guess what? You just hurt his ego. Now is what they're going to do? They're going to try and impose more will upon you. So you've actually gone backwards. You win the battle, you lose the war. So what you need to do is make that boss feel secure, massage their ego. Don't try and prove that you know more. Try and prove that you're there to support and help. And in the long run, that will be the beneficial way to improve that relationship. Let them recognize or let them feel secure with where they're at, and then they won't try and impose their will on you as the boss man. This is what I used to call in the SEAL teams classic overcorrection. And classic overcorrection, we'd see guys go too far in one direction because we're always talking about the dichotomy of leadership. Yeah. And I'd say to a guy, "Oh, you're doing too much. You're not doing enough decentralized command." And they do classic overcorrection, and they would lose control of everything. Mm-hmm. Or if we told them everyone was too wild and they didn't have control of anything, they'd go into level 9 micromanagement, and just lock everyone down. So yeah, you don't want to do a classic overcorrection. You want to moderate and modulate your efforts to make the person feel secure. No doubt about it.
Can you apply extreme ownership at mid-level management versus the C-suite level?
Well, this is absolutely true. Can you apply extreme ownership or the leadership principles that we talk about in extreme ownership? Can you apply them at mid-level management versus the executive level of the C-suite folks? And the answer is absolutely yes. And not only that, but extreme ownership applies through the entire chain of command. The principles are meant for everyone inside the chain of command because, as we talk about all the time, the leadership just doesn't mean the actual designated leaders. Every person on a team needs to be a leader. And while that may sound cliche, it is actually true. So not only that, but the senior executives at a company, the CEO, they work for somebody. Whether they work for a board, whether it's Steve Jobs in charge of Apple, guess what? He's reporting to shareholders. So everyone has some kind of boss. Everyone's working for somebody, and everybody needs to use these principles all the way up and down the chain of command. The principles of leadership don't change no matter where you are in the chain of command or what situation you're in. And that's why, we get called in to help every level of the chain of command, from the frontline troops, the equipment operators, the operators in the field, the salespeople on the front lines. We work with them all the way up to the C-suite and above. Just to be clear, though, when you do something right and you are in a leadership position, you actually don't take responsibility for it. You push that praise of accomplishment to the team.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You never want to absorb that.
Dang, that's advanced, bro.
How do I deal with setbacks, failures, delays, defeat, or other disasters? I actually have a fairly simple way of dealing with these situations. It is actually one word to deal with all those situations. And that is good. And this is actually something that one of my direct subordinates, one of my guys that worked for me, pointed out to me. And he would call me up or pull me aside with some major problem, some issue that was going on. And he'd say, boss, we got this and that and the other thing. And I'd look at him and I'd say, good. And finally one day he was telling me about some issue that he was having, some problem. And he said, I already know what you're going to say. And I said, well, what am I going to say? He said, you're going to say good. He said, that's what you always say. When something is wrong and going bad, you always just look at me and say good. And I said, well, yeah. And I mean it. And that is how I feel. When things are going bad, there's going to be some good that's going to come from it. And, mission got canceled? Good. We can focus on another one. Didn't get the new high-speed gear we wanted? Good. We can keep it simple. Didn't get promoted? Good. More time to get better. Didn't get funded? Good. We own more of the company. Didn't get the job you wanted? Good. You can get more experience and build a better resume. Got injured? Sprained my ankle? Good. I needed a break from training. Got tapped out? Good. It's better to tap in training than to tap out on the street. Got beat? Good. You learned. Unexpected problems? Good. We have the opportunity to figure out a solution. And that's it. That's it. When things are going bad, don't get all bummed out. Don't get startled. Don't get frustrated. No. You just look at the issue and you say, good. And I don't mean to say something that's all cliche, and I don't mean to sound like Mr. Positive. Find the positive, but do that. Focus on the good. Take that issue, take that problem, and make it something good. It'll bring that attitude to your team, too. You go forward. And lastly, like to close this out, if you can say the word good, guess what? It means you're still alive. It means you're still breathing. And if you're still breathing, well, then now you still got some fight left in you. So get up, dust off, reload, recalibrate, re-engage, and go out on the attack. And that right there is about as good as it gets.